It was a crisp autumn morning in 1966 when Sarah Thompson walked through the bustling airport terminal in New York City. At just 23 years old, she carried herself with quiet dignity, clutching her small leather handbag close as she made her way to the check-in counter. The air inside the terminal buzzed with activity. Businessmen in pressed suits hurrying to their gates, families caroling excited children, and airline staff moving purposefully through the crowds. Sarah had saved for months to afford this ticket to Los Angeles, where she hoped to pursue her dreams of becoming a teacher. Growing up in Atlanta, she had faced countless obstacles due to the color of her skin, but her mother had always taught her to hold her head high and never let anyone diminish her worth. As she approached the counter, Sarah couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in expression from some of the airport staff, the slight tightening of lips, the way some eyes would quickly look away when she made contact. These were reactions she had grown accustomed to, though they still stung. She handed over her ticket and identification with a polite smile, just as her mother had taught her. The check-in process went smoothly enough, though the clerk's words were clipped and professional, lacking the warmth she showed to other passengers. Sarah collected her boarding pass and made her way through the airport, her sensible shoes clicking against the polished floor as she navigated the crowded terminal. At the gate, Sarah sat quietly reading a worn paperback copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, a book that had deeply resonated with her experiences. She glanced up occasionally, watching as other passengers gathered for the flight. The gate area was filling up quickly with a mix of people, mostly white businessmen and families, with Sarah being one of only 2 African-American passengers visible. When boarding began, Sarah waited patiently for her row to be called. She had been assigned a window seat near the middle of the aircraft. As she walked down the jet bridge, she straightened her simple blue dress and took a deep breath, preparing herself for the next few hours in the confined space of the airplane. The aircraft interior was modern for its time, with rows of comfortable seats and overhead compartments that were quickly filling with passengers' belongings. Sarah found her row and carefully stored her handbag in the overhead bin before taking her seat. She could feel the curious glances from some passengers, while others deliberately avoided looking in her direction. What caught her attention, however, was the stewardess at the front of the cabin. The woman, whose name tag read Patricia, had been watching Sarah since she entered the aircraft, her blue eyes following her movements with barely concealed disapproval. Sarah recognized that look. She had seen it countless times before. As other passengers continued boarding, Sarah noticed someone familiar making his way down the aisle, a tall, striking man whose face she recognized from movie posters and television. Clint Eastwood, the actor who had recently gained fame from his roles in Western films, was on her flight. He moved with casual confidence, nodding politely to fellow passengers as he made his way to his seat several rows ahead of Sarah. The atmosphere in the cabin was typical of any flight in the mid-1960s, the mix of excitement and anxiety that came with air travel, the rustle of newspapers, and the quiet conversations between passengers. But there was also an undercurrent of tension, particularly around Sarah's row. She could see Patricia, the stewardess, whispering to another crew member, occasionally glancing in her direction. Sarah tried to focus on her book, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. She had experienced enough discrimination in her young life to recognize the signs of trouble approaching. The way Patricia moved through the cabin, checking seat belts and overhead bins, seemed calculated. Each time she passed Sarah's row, her movements became more rigid, her expression more stern. As the final passengers settled into their seats and the doors were prepared for closing, Sarah said a silent prayer, something her mother had taught her to do in moments of uncertainty. Little did she know that this routine flight was about to become anything but ordinary, and that the next few hours would turn into a significant moment not just in her life, but in the ongoing struggle against discrimination in America. The engines began to hum as the pilot announced their departure, but Sarah could sense that her journey was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would involve an unlikely hero in the form of Hollywood's rising star. The first signs of trouble began shortly after takeoff. As the aircraft leveled off and the seatbelt sign dimmed, Patricia, the stewardess, began her cabin service. She moved through the aisle with practiced efficiency, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers. However, when she reached Sarah's row, her demeanor shifted noticeably. "Your seatbelt isn't properly fastened," Patricia said sharply, despite Sarah's belt being securely clicked and adjusted. The young woman quietly tightened it further, maintaining her composure even as she felt other passengers' eyes turn toward her. Sarah had just opened her book again when Patricia returned. "Your bag is protruding into the aisle," she declared, pointing to Sarah's handbag, which was safely tucked under the seat in front of her. The harassment was becoming obvious to nearby passengers, who exchanged uncomfortable glances. An elderly woman sitting across the aisle whispered to her husband, "That's not right," but neither spoke up. Sarah adjusted her bag anyway, pushing it even further under the seat. She had learned early in life that sometimes keeping the peace meant swallowing your pride, no matter how unfair the situation. Patricia seemed determined to find fault. She returned repeatedly over the next 30 minutes, each time with a new complaint. The armrest wasn't properly positioned. Sarah's tray table wasn't fully locked. Her window shade was too far up, then too far down. Each interaction grew increasingly tense, with Patricia's voice rising just enough to draw attention, but not enough to seem obviously confrontational. Sarah maintained her dignity throughout, responding politely and making the requested adjustments without argument. Inside, though, her heart was racing. She had experienced discrimination before, but being trapped at 30,000 feet made this situation particularly unsettling. The breaking point came when Sarah reached into her bag for a tissue. Patricia, who had been watching like a hawk, immediately swooped in. "What are you taking out of that bag?" she demanded loudly, her voice carrying through the cabin. "I need to see what you're removing." Several passengers now turned to watch the scene unfold. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she held up the innocent tissue. "It's just a tissue, ma'am," she said softly, her voice steady despite her growing anxiety. Patricia's face flushed red. "I've been watching you," she announced, loud enough for nearby rows to hear. "You've been disruptive since boarding. You've refused to follow basic safety instructions. I'm going to have to ask the captain to make an emergency landing." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the cabin. Sarah felt her chest tighten as tears threatened to form in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Never let them see you cry, baby. Your dignity is your armor." The situation had escalated beyond anything Sarah had expected. Patricia turned to another stewardess and said loudly, "Radio the captain. Tell them we have an unruly passenger who needs to be removed." The second stewardess looked uncertain but moved toward the cockpit. Passengers around Sarah shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few shook their heads in disapproval, but most looked away, unwilling to get involved. The tension in the cabin was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her book forgotten beside her. She thought about her mother, about her dreams of teaching, about all the obstacles she had already overcome to get this far. The idea of being removed from the flight, of having her journey interrupted by such blatant discrimination, made her stomach churn. But something was about to change the dynamic of this confrontation. Several rows ahead, Clint Eastwood had been observing the situation unfold. His jaw tightened as he watched Patricia's increasingly aggressive behavior. Known for his strong sense of justice both on and off screen, Eastwood had seen enough. As Patricia stormed off to speak with other crew members, presumably to arrange for Sarah's removal, the atmosphere in the cabin grew even more tense. Passengers whispered among themselves, some expressing disgust at the treatment they were witnessing, others wondering what would happen next. What no one realized yet was that this incident was about to take an unexpected turn, as one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces prepared to step into the fray and challenge the discrimination playing out before him. The situation reached its boiling point when Patricia returned to Sarah's row, this time accompanied by the head stewardess. The shadows loomed over Sarah as she sat quietly, her hands still folded in her lap. The head stewardess, a woman named Barbara, wore a stern expression that suggested she had already made up her mind about the situation. "Miss," Barbara addressed Sarah with cold professionalism, "I understand you've been causing problems during our flight. We take safety violations very seriously." Her words carried an air of authority that made several nearby passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah looked up, her voice calm but firm. "I haven't violated any safety regulations, ma'am. I've complied with every request made of me." A few passengers nodded silently in agreement, having witnessed the entire unfair treatment. Patricia jumped in, her voice sharp and accusatory. She's been argumentative and disruptive since takeoff. She's refusing to follow basic instructions and making other passengers uncomfortable. This last claim caused several passengers to exchange confused glances, as it was clearly Patricia's behavior, not Sarah's, that had created the tense atmosphere. The head stewardess pulled out a clipboard and began writing. "We'll need to document this incident. The pilot has been notified, and we're considering making an emergency landing in Chicago to remove you from the flight." A collective gasp rippled through the nearby rows. The threat of an emergency landing seemed drastically out of proportion to the situation. Sarah felt her throat tighten, but she maintained her composure, even as Patricia continued listing alleged infractions. "She keeps reaching for her bag," Patricia added, her voice rising. "She's adjusting her seatbelt without permission. She's being defiant." Each accusation became more absurd than the last, making it increasingly clear to everyone within earshot that this was about something far different than airline safety. An elderly man a few rows back spoke up, his voice trembling with anger. "This is ridiculous. The young lady hasn't done anything wrong." But Barbara silenced him with a stern look, suggesting that interfering would only make matters worse. Sarah watched as Barbara wrote down more notes, her heart sinking as she realized how quickly this situation was spiraling out of control. The dream of reaching Los Angeles, of starting her new life as a teacher, seemed to be slipping away with each scratch of the pen against paper. Patricia, emboldened by Barbara's presence, began removing Sarah's bag from under the seat. "This needs to be inspected," she announced loudly. "For security purposes." Sarah reached for her bag instinctively. It contained all her important documents and the small amount of money she had saved for her new start. "Please," Sarah said quietly, "everything in there has already been through security screening." But Patricia yanked the bag away, causing some of its contents to spill onto the floor. Sarah's personal items, her wallet, a small Bible given to her by her mother, and a few photographs, scattered across the airplane floor. The humiliation of watching her private possessions roll under nearby seats was almost too much to bear. A young white woman in the row behind Sarah bent down to help gather the items, but Patricia snapped at her. "Leave those alone. They need to be inspected." The atmosphere in the cabin had become unbearably tense. Some passengers were openly expressing their disapproval now, while others stared intently out their windows, trying to avoid involvement in the unfolding drama. A businessman reading his newspaper muttered, "This is disgraceful," just loud enough to be heard. Barbara continued writing in her clipboard, seemingly deaf to the growing discontent among the passengers. "We'll be radioing ahead to have security meet us in Chicago," she announced. "This kind of behavior cannot be tolerated on our flights." Sarah sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed straight ahead, drawing on every ounce of strength her mother had instilled in her. The injustice of the situation was palpable, hanging in the air like a heavy cloud, but unknown to Sarah, help was about to arrive from an unexpected source. Several rows ahead, Clint Eastwood had been watching the scene unfold with increasing anger. The actor, known for his strong sense of justice both on and off screen, had seen enough. As Barbara turned to head back to the cockpit, Eastwood unbuckled his seatbelt, his face set with determination. The time for silent observation was over. Clint Eastwood sat in his seat, his jaw clenched as he observed the unfolding drama. Having risen to fame through his roles in westerns like Rawhide and A Fistful of Dollars, he was no stranger to portraying characters who stood up against injustice. But this was no movie script. This was real life, playing out at 30,000 feet. From his vantage point several rows ahead, he had witnessed every moment of Patricia's harassment of Sarah. The actor's keen eyes hadn't missed a single detail: the perfectly fastened seatbelt, the properly stored bag, the young woman's dignified responses to each baseless accusation. His fingers drummed quietly on his armrest as his anger grew. A flight attendant offered him a drink, but he waved it away, his attention focused on the scene behind him. He had seen this kind of discrimination before, both in Hollywood and in his everyday life, but something about this particular situation struck a deeper chord. Perhaps it was the trapped nature of being on an airplane, or the quiet dignity with which Sarah handled herself. As he watched Sarah's belongings scatter across the floor, Eastwood's memory flashed back to his early days in Hollywood, when he had witnessed similar acts of discrimination against talented actors and crew members who were turned away simply because of their race. He had always felt powerless then, but now, with his rising star status, he had the influence to make a difference. The murmurs of disapproval from other passengers reached his ears. He could hear their whispered conversations. "This isn't right. Someone should do something. Poor girl." But whispers weren't enough. Eastwood knew from experience that injustice thrived on the silence of bystanders. He found himself studying Sarah's face, the controlled expression, the slight trembling of her hands, the way she held herself with remarkable poise despite the humiliation being heaped upon her. It reminded him of his own daughter, and the world he hoped she would grow up in, a world better than this. Patricia's voice cut through his thoughts as she announced their potential emergency landing in Chicago. Eastwood noticed how the other passengers reacted, the uncomfortable shuffling, the averted eyes, the silent compliance with injustice. He had seen enough westerns to know that every story needed a hero, someone willing to stand up when others wouldn't. The actor's mind raced through potential scenarios. As a celebrity, he knew his words carried weight, but he also understood the delicate nature of the situation. One wrong move could make things worse for Sarah. He needed to intervene in a way that would be effective without escalating the tension further. Eastwood recalled a scene from one of his movies where his character had faced down a group of outlaws not with guns blazing, but with quiet, steely determination. Sometimes, he reflected, the most powerful stance was one of calm authority rather than aggressive confrontation. He watched as Barbara scribbled in her clipboard, documenting imaginary infractions. His trained actor's eye caught the subtle signs of uncertainty in her posture, the slight hesitation in her movements, the way she glanced at other passengers as if seeking validation for her actions. She wasn't as confident in this situation as she pretended to be. The actor's presence on the flight hadn't gone unnoticed by other passengers, but so far he had maintained his privacy by keeping to himself. Now, he realized it was time to use his celebrity status for something more important than autographs or publicity. As Barbara turned to head back to the cockpit, Eastwood made his decision. He had built his career playing characters who fought for justice, and now life was imitating art. The difference was that this time, the consequences were real, affecting a real person's life and dignity. With deliberate movements, he unbuckled his seatbelt. The quiet click seemed to echo in his mind as he prepared to stand. His face set in the determined expression that millions of moviegoers had come to recognize. Clint Eastwood prepared to step into a role more important than any he had played on screen, that of a real-life defender of justice. Clint Eastwood rose from his seat with the same commanding presence that had made him famous on screen. His tall frame drew immediate attention as he stepped into the aisle, and a ripple of recognition passed through the cabin. Patricia and Barbara, who were still standing near Sarah's row, turned at the sound of his approaching footsteps. "Ladies," Eastwood said, his voice carrying that distinctive calm authority that had become his trademark. "I believe we have a situation here that needs to be addressed." He positioned himself strategically between the flight attendants and Sarah, his presence creating an immediate shift in the cabin's atmosphere. Patricia's face flickered with recognition, but she attempted to maintain her authoritative stance. "Sir, this doesn't concern you. We're handling a security issue." Her voice, however, had lost some of its earlier conviction. Eastwood's response was measured but firm. "I've been watching this entire situation unfold," he said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear clearly. "And what I've seen isn't a security issue. What I've seen is harassment." The word harassment hung in the air like a thunderclap. Barbara stepped forward, clipboard still in hand. "Mr. Eastwood, we appreciate your concern, but airline protocol." "Protocol?" Eastwood interrupted, his voice taking on the steely edge that moviegoers would have recognized from his films. "I've been on enough flights to know airline protocol. This young lady hasn't violated any of them." He gestured toward Sarah, who sat watching the scene with a mixture of surprise and relief. Other passengers, emboldened by Eastwood's intervention, began to speak up. "He's right," called out the elderly man who had protested earlier. "She hasn't done anything wrong." More voices joined in, creating a chorus of support that had been silent just moments before. Patricia's face flushed red as she tried to regain control of the situation. "She's been disruptive, refusing to follow instructions." "I've been watching." Eastwood cut in again, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Every time you've approached her with a demand, no matter how unreasonable, she's complied without complaint. The only disruption I've seen has come from the crew. The actor then turned to address Barbara directly, his expression serious but calm. You're planning to make an emergency landing in Chicago? Over what exactly? A properly fastened seatbelt, a correctly stored bag? He paused, letting his words sink in. Or is there another reason? The implication was clear, and Barbara had the grace to look uncomfortable. Several passengers nodded in agreement, and the support for Sarah became more vocal. The young woman who had tried to help gather Sarah's belongings earlier spoke up. I've been watching too. This is discrimination, plain and simple. Eastwood continued, his voice now taking on a more conversational tone that somehow made his words even more powerful. I spent my career telling stories about justice and doing what's right. But this isn't a movie script. This is real life, and what's happening here isn't just wrong. It's illegal. He turned to the other passengers, his presence commanding their attention. We're all witnesses to this. Every person on this flight has seen what's really going on here, and I'm sure none of us want to be part of this kind of discrimination. The effect of his words was immediate and powerful. Other passengers began to voice their agreement more openly. The businessman with the newspaper stood up. I'll be happy to provide my contact information as a witness if needed, he announced firmly. Patricia and Barbara exchanged glances, their confidence clearly shaken. The power dynamic had shifted completely. What had started as two flight attendants asserting authority over a single passenger had transformed into a united front of passengers standing against injustice. Sarah remained quiet, but sat a little straighter in her seat, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of relief and gratitude. Eastwood turned to her briefly, giving her a respectful nod before facing the flight attendants again, waiting for their next move. The situation had reached its crucial moment. Patricia and Barbara stood frozen, their authority challenged not just by a Hollywood star, but by the moral weight of the entire cabin. The next few moments would determine whether justice would prevail at 30,000 feet. The tension in the airplane cabin had reached its peak. Barbara clutched her clipboard tightly, her knuckles white, while Patricia's face showed a mix of defiance and uncertainty. Clint Eastwood remained standing in the aisle, his presence creating an unmistakable barrier between the flight attendants and Sarah. Mr. Eastwood, Barbara began, attempting to regain control of the situation. While we respect your opinion, you don't understand all the factors involved here. Her voice wavered slightly as she spoke, betraying her diminishing confidence. Actually, Eastwood responded, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had made him famous. I understand the factors perfectly. Why don't you explain them to everyone? His challenge hung in the air, daring them to publicly justify their actions. Patricia stepped forward, her voice shrill with desperation. She's been disruptive. She's been reaching under her seat, adjusting her seatbelt without permission. She stopped abruptly as several passengers openly scoffed at these accusations. Let's examine those claims, Eastwood said, turning to address the entire cabin. How many of you have reached under your seat during this flight? Raise your hands. Dozens of hands went up immediately. And how many have adjusted your seatbelt? Even more hands rose. The flight attendants shifted uncomfortably as the absurdity of their accusations became increasingly apparent. A businessman in a dark suit stood up. I've been on 3 flights this week, he announced. Never once have I needed permission to adjust my seatbelt. Barbara attempted a different approach. This is an issue of airline security. No, Eastwood interrupted firmly. This is an issue of dignity and basic human rights. His words resonated through the cabin. And right now, every passenger on this plane is watching how your airline handles both. The confrontation had drawn the attention of the entire cabin. Even the children who had been playing noisily earlier were quiet, sensing the gravity of the moment. Sarah remained in her seat, her posture straight, her expression composed despite the storm swirling around her. Patricia made one last attempt to assert authority. We could have all of you removed when we land in Chicago, she threatened, though her voice lacked conviction. A woman in business attire 2 rows behind Sarah spoke up. I'm an attorney with Thompson and Brooks in Los Angeles. I'd be very interested in handling that case. Her statement caused Patricia to take an involuntary step backward. Eastwood's expression remained unchanged as he addressed Barbara directly. You have 2 choices right now. You can continue down this path, Make that emergency landing and face the consequences, including what I imagine will be some very interesting headlines tomorrow." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "Or you can end this now, apologize to this young lady, and let her enjoy the rest of her flight in peace." The standoff continued for several tense moments. Barbara looked uncertainly toward the front of the plane, perhaps considering consulting with the pilot. Patricia's earlier bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by a nervous energy as she realized how thoroughly the situation had slipped from her control. Other passengers had begun taking out their notepads, writing down names and contact information, preparing to serve as witnesses if needed. The attorney was openly taking notes, her pen scratching against paper in the tense silence. Finally, Barbara spoke, her voice now carrying a note of defeat. "I'll need to consult with the captain." She turned to leave, but Eastwood's voice stopped her. "Before you go," he said, "I think those belongings scattered on the floor need to be returned to their owner." He gestured to Sarah's personal items that still lay scattered from Patricia's earlier actions. Red-faced, Patricia bent down to gather the items. As she did, more passengers joined in, helping to collect Sarah's belongings and return them to her with murmured words of support and encouragement. The standoff had reached its critical moment. Barbara disappeared toward the cockpit, leaving Patricia standing awkwardly in the aisle. The entire cabin waited in anticipation, wondering what the next few minutes would bring. But one thing was clear. Thanks to Eastwood's intervention and the unified support of the passengers, the balance of power had shifted decisively. Silence filled the cabin as Barbara returned from the cockpit. Her face had lost its earlier sternness, replaced by a look of professional resignation. She approached Sarah's row, where Clint Eastwood still stood protectively, his presence a quiet reminder of the power shift that had occurred. "The captain has been briefed on the situation," Barbara announced, her voice carrying through the hushed cabin. "We will be continuing our flight to Los Angeles as scheduled." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the passengers, though Eastwood's expression remained unchanged, waiting for more. Barbara cleared her throat, clearly struggling with what came next. "Miss," she addressed Sarah directly, "on behalf of the airline, I want to extend our sincere apologies for any misunderstanding that may have occurred." The word misunderstanding caused several passengers to shake their heads in disapproval. Eastwood raised an eyebrow. "Misunderstanding?" His quiet challenge prompted Barbara to reconsider her words. "For the unfair treatment you received," she corrected herself, her voice stronger now. "It was inappropriate and unprofessional. You will, of course, be fully welcome to continue your journey with us." She turned to Patricia, who stood nearby looking thoroughly chastened. "Patricia will be moved to another section of the aircraft for the remainder of the flight." Sarah, who had maintained her dignity throughout the entire ordeal, spoke for the first time since Eastwood's intervention. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice clear and steady. The simple response carried more grace than the situation deserved. The attorney who had spoken up earlier raised her hand. "I'd like the record to show that this passenger was subjected to discriminatory treatment, and that it only stopped after the intervention of Mr. Eastwood and other passengers." She was still taking notes, her pen moving swiftly across her legal pad. Barbara nodded stiffly. "Your concerns have been noted. The airline will be conducting a full investigation into this incident." She glanced at Patricia. "There will be consequences for any inappropriate behavior." Patricia, now facing the reality of her actions, had lost all of her previous bravado. She mumbled something that might have been an apology before quickly retreating to the back of the plane, followed by the disapproving gazes of nearby passengers. Eastwood finally allowed himself to relax slightly. "I trust the rest of Miss Thompson's flight will be pleasant." It wasn't really a question, and Barbara understood this perfectly. "Of course," she assured him. "I'll personally ensure it." She turned to address the entire cabin. "We'd apologize for any disruption this may have caused to our other passengers. We'll be coming through shortly with complimentary refreshments." As the tension began to dissipate, passengers started talking among themselves, many approaching Sarah to offer words of support and share their contact information in case she needed witnesses later. The elderly couple across the aisle insisted on writing down their phone number, the wife patting Sarah's hand gently. Eastwood turned to Sarah. "Will you be all right?" he asked quietly, his famous intense gaze now softened with genuine concern. Sarah nodded, managing a small smile. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Eastwood. Thank you for standing up when others wouldn't." Her voice carried a strength that showed she had emerged from this ordeal not as a victim, but as a victor. The actor nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in her words. "Sometimes people just need someone to take the first step," he replied. "You showed more courage than anyone today." As Eastwood returned to his seat, other flight attendants began serving drinks and snacks, their manner notably warm and attentive, especially toward Sarah. The cabin gradually returned to its normal rhythm of conversation and movement, though there was a different energy now, one of shared triumph over injustice. Barbara made good on her word, checking on Sarah regularly throughout the flight, ensuring her comfort with an almost excessive attention that bordered on overcompensation. But Sarah handled it all with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the ordeal. The rest of the flight proceeded smoothly, with Sarah finally able to return to her book, though now surrounded by the protective awareness of her fellow passengers. What had begun as an attempt to humiliate and remove her had transformed into a moment of unity and justice, all because one person had chosen to stand up and others had found the courage to follow. As the plane touched down at Los Angeles International Airport, the incident that had occurred hours earlier had already begun rippling beyond the confines of the aircraft. Passengers exiting the plane paused to share final words of support with Sarah, many pressing business cards or written phone numbers into her hands. The attorney who had spoken up during the confrontation lingered behind to have a word with Sarah. "What happened today wasn't just wrong. It was illegal," she explained, handing Sarah her business card. "If you decide to pursue this matter, my firm would be interested in representing you. No charge." Sarah tucked the card carefully into her purse, touched by the gesture. Clint Eastwood was one of the last to depart. As he passed Sarah's row, he paused briefly. "Stay strong," he said simply, giving her a respectful nod. His words carried the weight of someone who understood that sometimes the quietest battles were the most important ones. News of the incident spread quickly through the airline industry. Within days, internal memos were circulated regarding proper treatment of passengers, and new training protocols were implemented. Patricia was suspended pending investigation, and Barbara was required to undergo additional sensitivity training. The story found its way to civil rights organizations, who used it as an example of both ongoing discrimination and the power of people standing together against injustice. While Sarah chose not to pursue legal action, preferring to focus on her teaching career, the incident became a talking point in airline employee training sessions. Weeks later, Sarah received a formal letter of apology from the airline's corporate office, along with a lifetime of free first-class upgrades. But more meaningful to her were the letters that arrived from other passengers who had witnessed the event, sharing how it had changed their perspective and inspired them to speak up against discrimination in their own lives. One elderly passenger wrote, "Watching Mr. Eastwood stand up for you reminded me that we all have the power to make a difference. Since that flight, I found my own voice to speak up when I see injustice." These letters Sarah kept in a special box, testimonies to how a moment of confrontation had transformed into a catalyst for change. The incident had a lasting impact on airline policies. New guidelines were established regarding passenger complaints, requiring multiple witnesses and documentation before any attempt to remove a passenger. Training programs were updated to include specific modules on avoiding discriminatory behavior and recognizing unconscious bias. Sarah went on to achieve her dream of becoming a teacher in Los Angeles. In her classroom, she occasionally shared the story with her students, not as a tale of victimhood, but as an example of how courage and dignity could triumph over prejudice. She taught them that sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination was maintaining one's composure while allowing others to reveal their own prejudices. Clint Eastwood rarely spoke publicly about the incident, but in later interviews about his career, he would sometimes reference it obliquely when discussing the responsibility that came with fame. "Sometimes the most important roles we play aren't on screen," he would say, leaving listeners to wonder about the full story. Years later, when asked about the most significant moments in her life, Sarah would include that flight among them, not because of the discrimination she faced. She had faced plenty of that before, but because of how it demonstrated the power of people standing together against injustice. The incident became a quiet but significant marker in the ongoing civil rights movement, an example of how change often happened not through grand gestures or public protests, but through individual acts of courage and conscience. It showed how one person's willingness to stand up could inspire others to find their own courage. As Sarah's teaching career flourished, she kept that flight's boarding pass tucked away in her diary. It served as a reminder that progress often came from unexpected sources, and that dignity, maintained in the face of discrimination, could be its own form of victory. The story lived on, passed from person to person, a testament to how a single moment of injustice, met with courage and solidarity, could become a catalyst for change. In the end, what had begun as an attempt to humiliate one passenger had instead become a powerful lesson in human dignity and the importance of standing up for what was right.